Let's understand a function inside of JavaScript. Let's imagine you have a console.log statement that allows you to console.log the number 15, for example, and now you have another console.log statement that allows you to log the number 14, for example. And now you just run the script, and this will output the number 15 and 14. Obviously, if you would have a lot more console.log statements, for example, or pretty much anything else, it would get kind of repetitive. And this is where you can use functions. A function basically allows you to execute the same code by using just one line over and over again. So you can define a function by using the function keyword. Now you need to give your function a name, which could, for example, say log in the console, or whatever you want to use. After the name, you use opening and closing brackets where you can add some arguments, and we'll get to this later on. And then you have the body of your function, which is indicated by opening and closing brackets once again. And inside of this body, you can define what you want this function to do basically. So let's say we want to log something inside of the console. So let's remove this console.log statement. And let's say inside of the console, we want to write hello from this function, for example. And now we're going to save this function or this document. And if you're going to run the code, you can see that we're basically not seeing anything. And the reason for this is we just defined the function, but we didn't call the function yet. And if you want to use a function, you always have to call the function. And you can do so by using the exact same name that you defined for the function and writing it out. And then by using opening and closing brackets, followed by a semicolon. And now you can save the file, run the code, and as you can see, we now have hello from this function. And now we can obviously also duplicate this function a couple of times. And if we run the file again, you can see that we just executed the code inside of this function block a couple of times. So obviously for this use case, it might seem kind of useless, but imagine we would have a lot more console.log statements in here, for example, or like usually function blocks are a lot more than just this, obviously. But let's say we just have some more console.log statements. And by using this, for example, let's have some different statements right here. And by using a function, we now can create all of those console.log statements just by typing out the name once. And I understand that it might not make too much sense if you just see this example, but especially when your functions get extremely complex, it might save you, or it will save you, a lot of code. So this is why functions are super important in JavaScript and in pretty much every programming language. Another thing that is really useful about functions is that you can define parameters inside of this function. So let's say we want to have a first name as a parameter, for example. And let's say we also want to have a last name. And now inside of this console.log statement, we, for example, want to greet a user. So let's say we're going to use console.log, and now we'll add our first name, for example, followed by a space, for example, and now we'll also add the last name. And now if we are going to save this code and run the code, as you can see, hello, undefined, undefined, because we didn't define anything inside of our function. So now if we define a parameter, we should ideally also, inside of our function call, define the arguments that will feed basically those parameters. For example, we could say that the first name is, for example, Jonas, and the last name is, for example, Bro. So now we have a first name and a last name defined as an argument. The function will basically take this argument, put it in here for the first name. So this one will be the first name, and this one will be the last name. And now it's going to console.log hello, first name and last name, because this is what we defined inside of our function body. So let's just run this code and we will see hello Jonas Bro. So as you can see, by using parameters, you can define pretty complex logic inside of your function, and this function will now behave different for every input you use for this function. So now we could also greet, for example, someone else. We could, for example, literally greet someone else if we wanted to do so. And now we could run the function once again, and now we are greeting Jonas Bro and someone else. As you can see, by using those parameters, you can make functions extremely flexible. And also, just a short note, when defining the function, you basically call these things parameters, and when calling the function, you basically call these things arguments. So this is just a naming convention, doesn't really matter too much, to be honest, but yeah.